Hello and welcome back to Viral Shakespeare. This is Dr. Rusty Jones, and I'm still talking about King Lear. And for this installment of Viral Shakespeare, I'm going to slow it down a little bit. I want to focus only on Act 3, Scene 7, and I want to discuss one of the more important and one of the more shocking things that happened in that scene in a little bit more depth so that we can get a little bit more into the play and slow things down a little bit and talk about some more themes. So want to start off with a trigger warning. So I'm a big believer in trigger warnings. I'm going to have a lot of discussions today in the next 30 minutes about violence, about forms of torture as displayed on stage. And so if depictions of violence, particularly the violence that occurs in Shakespeare's plays, is something that you find disturbing, you might want to tune out because I am going to talk about those things in a little bit of depth here. So with that said, I want to start with a thematic word for you. And don't worry if you can't pronounce any of these words. I promise I won't make fun of you. The word, though, where I want to start is the word obscene. I'm a big believer in etymology, especially when I'm talking about thematic issues. So, comes from the Latin obscanus, which means morally offensive or ill-omened. And I'm going to get into that more in a little bit. Something that is obscene from the Latin is something that is considered either morally offensive, offensive to one's system of beliefs, or ill-omened, meaning it portends something particularly terrible to come, something far worse as far as justice in the universe is concerned. There's also a folk etymology to the word obscene, and a folk etymology is one that is generally accepted to be true, but ultimately is not true. But it's an interesting one, and I think I want to raise it with you here. So the folk etymology, there we go, of obscene is from the Greek obscena, meaning off stage. And I'm sorry, I know this is particularly nitpicky of me to complete my quote marks, but there we go. Obscena, off stage. Now, the source of this folk etymology is that in ancient Greek theater, a lot of the violence, particularly the more shocking violence, happens off stage. That it is considered too obscene, too morally objectionable, too potentially ill-omened, like it's going to bring bad luck, to show that violence on the stage. Far better, apparently the ancient Greeks thought, to have the violence happen off stage and then be told about it on stage so that your imagination could fill in the gaps and make it in some ways even more horrible. When, for example, Oedipus pokes out his eyes, that happens off stage and we're told about it. When Antigone hangs herself in the cave, we hear about that. We don't actually see her hanging there. Whether or not, again, this is a folk etymology, but it's something that's important, I think, to talk about for a second, because what violence you do and do not show on the stage, I think, is relatively important. And Shakespeare makes a lot of different choices for what violence he wants to put on the stage and what violence he wants to have off the stage. So I made a brief list of violence that happens on stage and we get to actually witness versus violence that happens in a way that is obscene, meaning off the stage, but is reported. And then I want to talk about obscene acts of violence that probably should have happened off stage, but actually happen on stage. And I think Shakespeare reserves some of his more shocking deaths for the obscene acts that should happen out of the audience's eye shot because they are either morally offensive or they could bring on, terrible retribution because they're ill-omened. But Shakespeare, in fact, brings them out onto the stage so that we can look at them. And I think one of them happens in Act 3, Scene 7 of King Lear, which is what I'm focusing on today. So some of the deaths that happen in Shakespeare, I don't want to say that they're not big deals, but they happen a lot. Stabbings, for example, whether with a short knife or with a sword or whatever, that's fairly common in Shakespeare. Poisoning is also fairly common in Shakespeare. And a lot of those do happen on stage. Not that they aren't shocking, not that they aren't upsetting, but Shakespeare doesn't make it so those things happen off stage, with a few exceptions. So poisoning on stage, for example. Gertrude is poisoned in Hamlet. Romeo poisons himself in Romeo and Juliet. Cleopatra poisons herself with 2 snakes. in Antony and Cleopatra. Stabbings on stage, there are so many of them. There are way too many of them for me to mention here. But Juliet stabs herself. Mercutio gets run through. Julius Caesar is stabbed more than once. Brutus is stabbed. Edmund in King Lear ends up stabbed by his half-brother Edgar. Sorry, I should have spoiler alerted that for you. Claudius in Hamlet is both stabbed and poisoned. The treacherous, murderous, damned Dane. Then there are stabbings that happen off stage that do fit more into the category, I think, of obscenity because they are, in some ways, particularly shocking. Shakespeare has killed kings on stage before. For example, Richard II, when he is sent to prison by Henry Bolingbroke in the play Richard II. He is attacked and he is murdered right there in the cell, and we are allowed to see that. But in Macbeth, King Duncan is stabbed off stage. He is stabbed obscena. He is stabbed in the in the wings, and we hear about it. Why make the difference between Richard II being murdered on stage and Duncan being murdered off stage? I don't really know. Besides dramatic effect, I don't really know. Richard II has a lot of moral foibles and flaws, although we do still feel bad, I think, when he is murdered outright in his cell. But Duncan in Macbeth is described as basically this side of a holy man, that nobody questions anything about his morality. Macbeth himself is deeply afraid that if he is to kill Duncan, God and the angels will cry out the inhumanity and the immorality of the act of killing such a holy man. So I don't know if the holiness is the difference, but killing a holy king apparently is bad enough that Shakespeare has Duncan's murder happen off stage. Other deaths and violence that happen obscena off stage include, some of them really quite shocking, and I understand why they happen off stage. It increases the dramatic effect to hear about how terrible they were, like Ophelia's drowning in Hamlet, for example. Some of them might be considered a little bit silly. Antigonus pursued by and eaten by a bear in Winter's Tale. Who knows? Might have been considered shocking and terrible at the time. For us, it's a little bit funny. One that kind of crosses the line between these is Lavinia in Titus Andronicus. She is raped and mutilated so that she cannot communicate who her rapists were. They cut off her hands and they cut out her tongue. We do not see those things happen on the stage, but we hear about them, and Lavinia actually comes out onto the stage and shows us the effects of her mutilation, her violation. And it is very, very shocking to have something that awful that happens obscena off stage in an obscene way brought onto stage and displayed to us. So I think Lavinia kind of crosses over that. Her rapists are killed and cooked into a pie and fed to their mom in Titus Andronicus, and that happens off stage too. And I get that. That's pretty obscene. That's pretty intense. The ones I want to talk about that are particularly shocking, I think, immoral, ill-omened, that perhaps should have happened obscenely, obscena off stage, but in fact happened on stage. I picked three, but you can write to me privately if you want and tell me about more. Macduff's son in Macbeth, little, I don't know, 7 to 10-year-old, who knows how old he is, but he's fairly young. Macduff's son, who has a little argument with his mother before he's outright murdered by Macbeth's forces. That to me is obscene. The death of the Macduff children and Macduff's wife, we are told frequently in the play, in the aftermath, just what a moral violation this is. And it is really, really quite shocking. We get to witness that one. Desdemona being smothered on stage by Othello in Othello. To me, it's such a violation of a very good woman who's been very true to Othello, despite having all sorts of accusations of immorality thrown at her, and she is smothered on stage by her own husband. And then there's Gloucester in Act 3, Scene 7 of King Lear, who has his eyes put out. And that is where I want to focus just for the rest of this. I want to focus on Act 3, Scene 7. So I am turning there now. There we go. It begins with enter Cornwall, Regan, they're married, recall that. Goneril, but not her husband Albany, who, as we're going to learn later, she describes as, milk-livered, that he has a kind of a change of heart about all of the evil, immoral things that Goneril, Regan, and Cornwall are up to. Goneril's husband Albany has a kind of change of heart. Enter Cornwall, Regan, Goneril, bastard, brackets, Edmund. Interesting, I think it is in the folio version that his name is left out of that stage direction. It's just his title, Bastard, which I'll come back to in a little bit. And servants. Cornwall to Goneril. Post speedily to my lord your husband. Show him this letter. The army of France is landed. Seek out the traitor Gloucester. Exeunt some servants. Hang him instantly, says Regan. Pluck out his eyes, says Goneril. That is really meant to be, I think, quite shocking. Remember, Gloucester has sent off a ring and said, let France know that this terrible stuff is happening with Cordelia's sisters. Make sure that France sends a force. Gloucester has sided with Lear. Now the conspiracies are flying, and Gloucester's being accused of being the one to impel the forces of France to land and to fight against the forces of Goneril and Regan. So they're going to seek Gloucester out and pluck out his eyes, as Goneril says, which not only it's not a case that no woman should come up with a torment that immoral, that horrifying, but that any human being would do that. Pluck out his eyes. Cornwall, leave him to my displeasure. Edmund, the bastard, keep our sister company. The revenges we are bound to take upon your traitorous father are not fit for your beholding. Well, gee, nice that, you have some scruples. Not really, though. Advise the Duke where you are going to a most festinate preparation. We are bound to the like. Enter the steward. How now, where's the king? My lord of Gloucester hath conveyed him hence. So we think Gloucester is, in fact, going to get away, but, in fact, he is not. Gloucester is brought in around line 28 or so. Enter Gloucester and servants. Who's there? The traitor. Regan says, ingrateful fox, 'tis he. Cornwall, bind fast his corky arms. Gloucester, what means your grace is good, my friends? Consider you are my guests. Do me no foul play, friends, which is exactly what they are going to do. Bind him, I say. And so they bind Gloucester. They treat him in a very immoral and inhospitable manner. They find out that Gloucester, by giving him some slight torments to begin with, has sent Lear to Dover, where they're going to try to intercept the Mad King, as Cornwall calls him. And Regan asks at line 54, why did you send him to Dover? Regan, wherefore to Dover? Why did you send him to Dover? Gloucester says, because I would not see thy cruel nails pluck out his poor old eyes. Gloucester doesn't know he's foreshadowing what's going to happen to him. We do, because we have heard Goneril say, pluck out the traitor's eyes. But it brings up the thematic subject of blindness, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more soon. So it's awful and shocking that he says, I don't want to see Lear have his eyes plucked out by you, when we know that that's the fate that Gloucester's going to be facing in a minute here. But also, this is what Gloucester's going to face, and it brings up the subject that he has been blind to this point, figuratively speaking. Now it's going to be literal. Nor thy fierce sister, continues Gloucester, in his anointed flesh stick boorish fangs. Talking about how immoral and monstrous these women have become, so that they could even potentially entertain this idea of plucking out somebody's eyes. The sea with such a storm has his bare head in hell-black night endured, would have buoyed up and quenched the stellid fires. Yet poor old heart, he holp the heavens to rain, if wolves had at thy gate howled that stern time. Thou shouldst have said, good porter, turn the key. He was so pitiful you would have let him in. As cruel as you are, all cruels else subscribe. But I shall see the winged vengeance overtake such children. I'll see you guys, you Goneril and Regan, I will see you revenged upon. And Cornwall says in a shocking way, see it, vengeance, shalt thou never. Now, one, he thous him. It's a sign of disrespect. He is also basically alluding to the fact that he's about to pluck out Gloucester's eyes. Fellows, hold the chair. Upon these eyes of thine, I'll set my foot. And Cornwall begins, and he puts out one of Gloucester's eyes. How is this done on stage? Well, any number of ways. Gloucester probably is not facing the audience. Cornwall can come in very close and pretend he can mock up poking out Gloucester's eyes while he in fact rubs some stage blood on his face. I've seen that done in quite a number of ways. Where they really want to bring the obscene component forward, when a director really wants to make this both ill-omened and particularly morally reprehensible, sometimes an eye will come out. I saw it done in London one time where Cornwall was palming something. I don't know what it was, but I think I figured it out. And when he went in and threw his hand away, an eyeball went bouncing across the stage. I suspect it may have been an animal eyeball, but if it wasn't, it was extraordinarily well made. And the audience lost their minds. Something that should have had reported to us because our imagination would be quite enough to shock us and make us understand the immorality of these characters. We actually got to see. And it's stunning when that happens. Finally, before they can pluck out his other eye, a servant actually stands up and says, "This has got to stop," which is really, really extraordinary as far as an intervention is concerned. Servants simply do not stand out against their masters, but Cornwall's actions and Regan's actions and Goneril's are so reprehensible at this point that a lowly servant speaks up and says, "Hold your hand, my lord, I have served you ever since I was a child. But better service have I never done you than now to bid you hold. Regan, how now, you dog? Servant, if you did wear a beard upon your chin, I'd shake it on this quarrel." He threatens Regan. "If you were a man, I'd let you have it. What do you mean? Cornwall, my villain, servant, nay then come on, and take the chance of anger." They draw and fight. Cornwall is wounded, and Regan stabs the servant who has attempted to do something moral and good and has paid for it. He dies, but he wounds Cornwall mortally in the exchange. But not before Cornwall can step forward again and say, line 82 or so, "Lest it see more, prevent it. Out, vile jelly," referring to Gloucester's eyes. He puts out Gloucester's other eye. "Where is thy luster now? Gloucester, all dark and comfortless, where's my son Edmund? Edmund, enkindle all the sparks of nature to quit this horrid act." We as audience, in a moment of dramatic irony, understand that is particularly pitiful because Edmund's the one who's really set his father off. And Gloucester, even when he has been physically blinded, remains metaphorically blinded to the evils of his half-child Edmund, that he himself may have some responsibility for, but he remains blinded to it, and I'll talk about that theme in a second. Cornwall, finally, near the end of this scene, says, "Regan, I bleed apace. I'm bleeding like crazy. Untimely comes this hurt. Give me your arm," and they exit. But if you go back to the quarto version, and this would be back, if you have my textbook, at page 88, Act 3, Scene 7, this scene is not finished. Now we have servants again who get to actually end the scene by giving a kind of moral commentary that is lacking in the folio. I talked about this in a previous video. Second servant, "I'll never care what wickedness I do if this man come to good." In other words, hey, if Cornwall prosper, morally it doesn't matter what I do anymore if these people can get away with this kind of evil. The third servant, "If she," Regan, "live long and in the end meet the old course of death," if she gets to live to be 80, 90 years old, "women will all turn monsters. She'll be rewarded for such evil." Now, if you know the play, you know that these things aren't going to happen. Cornwall's going to die. Regan's going to die young. They are going to get a certain amount of heavenly vengeance upon them, and yet there's this sort of moral question. If the nobles can get away with this, then why can't we lowly people also get away with this? We live in that level of injustice and immorality in this universe. Second servant, "Let's follow the old earl," that would be Gloucester, "and get the bedlam to lead him," that would be Edgar disguised as poor Tom, "where he would. His roguish madness allows itself to anything," that would be poor Tom / Edgar. Third servant, "Go thou. I'll fetch some flax and whites of egg to apply to his," Gloucester's, "bleeding face. Now heaven help him." And there's an appeal to the mercy and justice of heaven that's completely lacking from the folio. So I've got a few minutes left, so I want to talk about the theme of blindness again. because now Gloucester, in a way that is particularly obscene because it happens right in front of us instead of offstage, is now physically blind, where before he has been metaphorically blind to the evil of his son, one, and also to his participation, to whatever degree you believe, in creating that evil. Remember, he's called Bastard, not Edmund in the stage direction. He's called Bastard. That social designation is what dominates his life. And am I saying society is at fault for all of the evil that Edmund does and Edmund is? No, I'm not. And yet, I think it's interesting that that label is the one that follows him around so much. And Gloucester is so horrible to him right off the bat, talking about his parentage in such an offhand way, like his mother really meant nothing to him, like the boy means absolutely nothing to him. Does that excuse what Edmund does? No, of course it does not. And yet Gloucester is blind both to his son, or his bastard son's evil, and to his own participation in it. I would also say that Gloucester, now physically blind and calling for Edmund, not realizing that Edgar the good son is the one who's going to actually lead him to some form of, I don't know, I won't call it moral salvation so much as kind of psychological quiet, but he has been very blind to Edmund's trickery, and I think he doesn't understand how willfully blind he is to Edmund's trickery, how easily he is tricked, and I think what Shakespeare is up to here is a commentary, if not a condemnation, on another social system. Not just, it's closely related to this idea of bastardy, illegitimacy, etc., etc. It's this idea of primogeniture. Again, meaning inheritance by the firstborn male child. We see that with Henry VIII, of course, marrying women, divorcing women, beheading women, one woman outliving him, one dying in childbirth, etc., so that he could have that firstborn legitimate male child who could inherit everything, the throne, the realm, all the money and titles, etc., that go with it. This is a system that is absolutely rife, a social and legal system that is rife throughout Shakespeare's time period. Maybe with Gloucester's blindness to Edmund, we get a little bit of a negative commentary on this system of primogeniture. I have a note here suggesting that what Shakespeare's doing in making Gloucester so blind, so easily tricked by Edmund, is that he is pointing out that one of the inescapable consequences of primogeniture is dissent, plotting, competition, paranoia, fear. The case of Henry VIII aside, if you have multiple male children, are they not going to compete with each other for preeminence? Once the father dies and everything passes to the firstborn male, are others not going to feel slighted by how that male distributes things? Are they not going to try to overthrow the firstborn male child so that they become the dominant child, so that they get everything? This system creates the kind of division and dissent that we see right off the bat in this play, with the division of the kingdoms and the division of the family. The example, and going back to where in Act 1, Scene 2, Gloucester is quick to believe the phony baloney letter that Edmund produces, supposedly from Edgar, about how they're going to, or how Edgar wants to supposedly kill his own father, so that then, with Edmund's help in doing that, he promises to split things with Edmund, so that Edmund isn't completely left out in the cold. He reads again at line 47, Act 1, Scene 2, reading this fake letter. "This policy and reverence of age makes the world bitter to the best of our times, keeps our fortunes from us, till our oldness cannot relish them." That would be primogeniture. The older daddy gets, the more we just have to hang around waiting for him to die so that we can get our money. I can get it first, supposedly says Edgar, and I can pass it on to you, Edmund. The longer daddy lives, the more we got to wait for this. Why not just kill him now? I'm not saying that happened routinely with primogeniture, but I am saying maybe this is a commentary from Shakespeare about the faults or the weak points in a system like primogeniture. Let's see. "I begin to find an idle and fond bondage in the oppression of age tyranny," supposedly Gloucester there, "who sways not as it hath power, but as it is suffered, meaning put up with or endured. Come to me, that of this I may speak more. If our father would sleep till I waked him, you should enjoy half his revenue forever, and live the beloved of your brother Edgar. Conspiracy, says Gloucester. Sleep till I wake him? You should enjoy half his revenue? My son Edgar, had he a hand to write this, a heart and brain to breed it in? When came you to this? Who brought it? And he's so quick to believe that his own child would be so fed up with waiting for primogeniture to kick in, which means that the dad has to die first, that he would just go ahead and solicit his half-brother to murder so that we can just go ahead and get the money and we can pass it on and we can be done with ancient daddy who we, as the word says here, who we don't love out of anything because of his nobility. We just have to suffer him. We just have to endure and put up with him. All of this feeds into the worst kind of paranoias that old fathers could have experienced in primogeniture. The longer I live, the more anxious my kids get for me to die so that things can be passed down. Gosh, what if they just kill me so that they can just get it and I'll just be out of the way? Gloucester just feeds on that paranoia. And he is so fast to believe that his legitimate elder child, male child, would plot in such a way that he instantly jumps to the worst possible conclusion. He's completely blind to the moral goodness of his legitimate son, and so easy to accept, or so quick to accept the potential immorality based on his own paranoia that someone desperately wants his money, and to get that money, it means the dad must die. Whether naturally or unnaturally, the dad must die. So Gloucester remains blind even when he is physically blind. He remains blind until his good son Edgar, disguised as poor Tom and leading his poor blind father off through the wilderness, finds some way to try to give his soul, give his spirit some kind of comfort, until by the end, as Edgar reports to Edmund in Act 5, our father's heart burst smilingly. Yes, he died from his suffering, and yet there was some comfort that only I, Edgar, could offer him. Enjoy your weekend, and I will see you next week for more King Lear. Stay safe.